coming off Blackwater Bay carried the scent of salt and wet stone across the heights of Dragonstone. Far below, waves crashed against volcanic cliffs that had stood there long before the Targaryens arrived and would remain long after they were gone. Above those cliffs rose towers twisted into the shapes of dragons, their black walls glistening beneath the pale light of dawn. Somewhere in the distance a dragon stirred. The sound was deep enough to be felt before it was heard, a vibration rolling through stone and air alike, long before a single king in Westeros understood what was coming. The island already knew. This is the complete story of Aegon the Conqueror and his sisters, Visenya and Rhaenys, the three dragon lords who reshaped an entire continent. Settle in and let the tale unfold slowly as the world grows quiet around you. If you have listened before, mention which night of the journey this is for you. If you are new here, simply claim night 1. Our story begins not with a battle nor with a crown, but with a family that survived the greatest catastrophe in recorded history and carried its secrets across the sea. Why did House Targaryen survive when nearly every other Dragon Lord family perished? The answer begins more than a century before Aegon ever dreamed of conquest. In the ancient days of the Valyrian freehold, dozens of powerful Dragon Lord houses ruled the greatest empire the known world had ever seen. Roads of fused black stone crossed continents. Dragons filled the skies above Valyria. Wealth flowed from the 14 flames, the immense volcanoes whose fires fueled the freehold's power. Yet among all those mighty families stood House Targaryen, not the strongest and not the wealthiest, a lesser Dragon Lord house by the standards of old Valyria. The turning point came through a girl named Daenerys Targaryen. According to the histories preserved in the world of ice and fire, Daenerys experienced prophetic dreams that foretold the destruction of Valyria. Her father, Enar Targaryen, chose to believe her. 12 years before the doom, he sold his holdings in the freehold and relocated his family, wealth, servants, dragons, and household to Dragonstone, a fortress that Valyria had established centuries earlier at the western edge of its influence. Other dragon lords mocked the decision. To abandon the heart of the freehold for a lonely island in the narrow sea seemed madness. Yet when the doom came in 114 BC, mountains exploded, cities vanished, and the greatest civilization in the world collapsed in fire and ash. House Targaryen remained alive because one family listened to a dream. That detail lingers over everything that follows. Long before Aegon was born, prophecy already stood in the background of Targaryen history. Centuries later, readers would debate whether another dream helped drive Aegon toward conquest. Some point to traditions mentioned in later Targaryen histories. Others note that the written sources from Aegon's own lifetime never explicitly state such a motivation. The mystery remains unresolved, yet even without certainty, it is impossible to ignore how often the fate of House Targaryen seems to turn upon dreams that other people dismiss. Dragonstone itself became the surviving outpost of a lost civilization. The fortress did not resemble the castles of Westeros. Its towers curved like wings. Gargoyles took the forms of snarling dragons. Great halls were carved from black volcanic stone. The island sat between worlds, closer to Westeros than to old Valyria, yet shaped entirely by Valyrian culture. For more than 100 years after the Doom, the Targaryens remained there, watching kingdoms rise and fall across the narrow waters. They possessed dragons, but they did not immediately seek to conquer the continent before them. The future kingdom of Westeros remained divided, while Dragonstone endured as a small but formidable power. Generations passed before Aegon entered the story. He was born to Aerion Targaryen and Valyna Velaryon. Through his father came the blood of old Valyria. Through his mother came another ancient Valyrian line, House Velaryon of Driftmark, famed sailors whose fortunes would become deeply tied to the Targaryens. Aegon grew up surrounded by reminders of his heritage. Every carved dragon staring down from a tower, every Valyrian custom preserved on Dragonstone, every story of the Doom reinforced the same lesson. The Targaryens had survived where countless others had vanished. Yet Aegon never stood alone. From the beginning, his life intertwined with two remarkable women. His elder sister Visenya Targaryen was fierce, disciplined, and formidable. She became one of the greatest warriors of her age and carried the Valyrian steel sword Dark Sister. His younger sister Rhaenys possessed a very different nature. Contemporary accounts describe her as sociable, curious, and fond of music. Where Visenya commanded respect through strength, Rhaenys often inspired affection through charm. Together they formed a partnership unlike anything Westeros had ever seen. The customs of old Valyria allowed marriage between siblings, a practice that shocked many Westerosi lords, but remained central to Targaryen identity. Aegon married both sisters. Visenya became his elder queen. Rhaenys became his younger queen. Later generations would argue endlessly about whom Aegon truly loved most. Some chroniclers insist he spent 10 nights with Rhaenys for every one spent with Visenya. Others suggest the relationship was more complicated than the songs admit. Whatever the truth, both women occupied essential places in his life, and neither can be separated from the story of the conquest. Why do so many later tales focus almost entirely on Aegon himself, when the conquest was clearly the work of 3 dragon riders? The question becomes more intriguing the closer one examines the records. Visenya was not merely a queen. She was a strategist, warrior, and rider of Vagar. Rhaenys was not merely a consort. She commanded armies, negotiated submissions, and rode Meraxes. Aegon possessed Balerion, the Black Dread, the largest and most fearsome dragon alive. Yet no single dragon could have conquered Westeros alone. The conquest succeeded because 3 dragon lords acted together. Their dragons deserve attention before the wars begin. Balerion had been born in Valyria itself before the Doom. His black scales and immense size made him a living relic of the vanished freehold. Vagar, ridden by Visenya, would eventually become one of the largest dragons in Targaryen history. Meraxes, ridden by Rhaenys, was also enormous, though slightly smaller than Vagar and Balerion. When people in later centuries imagined dragonfire, they imagined creatures descended from these legends. Together, the 3 dragons represented a concentration of power unseen anywhere else in the known world. As the years passed, Aegon increasingly turned his attention westward. Across the narrow waters lay a continent divided among rival kings. House Stark ruled from Winterfell in the north. House Lannister held Casterly Rock in the Westerlands. House Gardner ruled the fertile Reach from Highgarden. House Arryn governed the Vale from the Eyrie. House Durrandon controlled the Stormlands from Storm's End. House Hoare ruled both the Iron Islands and the Riverlands from the vast fortress of Harrenhal. In Dorne, House Martell maintained its own independent principality. These kingdoms fought, schemed, married, and warred against one another as they had for centuries. From the heights of Dragonstone, the fractured political landscape must have appeared very different than it did to those living within it. The kings of Westeros viewed themselves as ancient rulers defending their ancestral rights. Aegon saw 7 crowns competing against one another. The distinction mattered. One perspective looked inward toward tradition. The other looked outward toward opportunity. Somewhere amid the sea winds, dragon shadows, and black stone towers of Dragonstone, a possibility began to take shape. Before armies marched and castles burned, before the Iron Throne existed, before a city called King's Landing rose beside the Blackwater Rush, there was only an island fortress and a dragon lord gazing across the water toward a continent that did not yet realize its history was about to change. Why did Aegon choose that particular moment to act after more than a century of Targaryen rule on Dragonstone? The question hangs over the beginning of the conquest because the timing was not random. For generations, the Targaryens possessed dragons powerful enough to threaten Westeros, yet no earlier lord of Dragonstone attempted what Aegon would attempt. By the closing years before the conquest, the political balance of the continent had become especially unstable. Harrenhal had recently completed the colossal fortress of Harrenhal after decades of labor and crushing taxation. The Riverlands groaned beneath Ironborn domination. Rival kings watched one another with suspicion. Whether Aegon saw opportunity, necessity, ambition, or some combination of all three, the moment had arrived. The most famous symbol of his preparation stood within Dragonstone itself. The painted table had been carved from a single immense slab of wood and shaped into a map of Westeros. Rivers, forests, mountains, coastlines, and islands appeared in painted detail. There were no political borders carved upon it. That absence often captures the imagination because it reflects a truth Aegon seemed to understand. Kings imagined invisible lines separating their realms. Geography did not. The mountains remained mountains regardless of which crown claimed them. Many years later, some readers and historians would wonder whether Aegon already envisioned a united realm while studying that table. The surviving sources cannot reveal every thought that passed through his mind. What they do reveal is action. Aegon began gathering allies among houses that already possessed ties to Dragonstone. House Valyrian stood beside him. House Celtigar supported him. Trusted companions assembled around him, among them Orys Baratheon, whom later tradition frequently describes as Aegon's bastard half-brother, though no contemporary source ever formally confirms the relationship. Whether brother by blood or merely brother by loyalty, Orys would soon become one of the most important figures in the conquest. Across the water, the kings of Westeros had little reason to imagine that their world was about to change forever. In the Reach, King Mern the Ninth Gardener ruled from Highgarden, claiming descent from Garth Greenhand himself. In the Westerlands, King Loren the First Lannister governed one of the richest kingdoms on the continent. King Argilac Durrandon, known as Argilac the Arrogant, held Storm's End and ruled the Stormlands. King Torrhen Stark watched over the north from Winterfell. In the Vale, young King Ronel Arryn sat upon the Falcon Throne while his mother, Regent Shara Arryn, wielded power in his name. Each ruler viewed local rivals as the primary threat. Few yet understood that dragons had returned to the center of history. One of the first sparks came from Argilac Durandon. The aging Storm King faced growing pressure from Harrenhal's expanding power. Seeking alliance, he reportedly offered Aegon lands and marriage ties in exchange for support. The details differ slightly among sources, but the broad outline remains consistent. Argilac expected cooperation from a neighboring lord. Instead, he encountered a man whose ambitions had already outgrown Dragonstone. When negotiations failed, the relationship soured rapidly. The Storm King insulted Aegon's envoy and sent the man's hands back in a box. Why respond to insult with conquest rather than revenge alone? Because by then, Aegon had already moved beyond disputes between individual rulers. The response that followed was larger than retaliation. He sent ravens throughout Westeros, demanding submission. The message was simple. The kings of Westeros could bend the knee peacefully and retain lands, titles, and honors beneath a new overlord, or they could resist and face Dragonfire. It was a stark choice. For proud dynasties that traced their ancestry back thousands of years, it was also an unacceptable one. In the year later known as 1 AC, Aegon crossed the waters of Blackwater Bay. The landing itself appears almost modest when compared with the legends that followed. There was no great city waiting there. No mighty fortress dominated the shore. The place consisted largely of hills, woods, fishing villages, and open ground near the mouth of the Blackwater Rush. Yet history often gathers around locations that seem ordinary before events transform them. Aegon and his followers established a fortified camp upon the site. In time, that camp would become the capital of an empire. The first structure raised there was known simply as the Aegon Fort. Built from timber and earthworks, it lacked the grandeur later associated with the Iron Throne. Yet from this humble beginning, orders flowed outward across the continent. Nearby lords quickly faced a decision. Some resisted, others submitted. House Rosby bent the knee. House Stokeworth followed. These early submissions mattered because they demonstrated the practical side of Aegon's approach. Lords who yielded were generally confirmed in their holdings. Aegon preferred obedience to destruction. Meanwhile, his sisters moved with him as equal participants in the campaign. Visenya rode Vagar. Rhaenys rode Meraxes. Their presence multiplied the speed and reach of the invasion. When one studies the campaign closely, the conquest resembles 3 simultaneous wars rather than one. Aegon could strike in one region while his sisters operated elsewhere. Messages traveled by raven, dragons traveled by sky. Medieval armies measured distance in days and weeks. Dragon riders measured it differently. Why did so many lords choose submission before witnessing a major battle? Fear explains part of the answer, but not all of it. The memory of dragons never entirely disappeared from Westerosi knowledge. Merchants, sailors, and maesters understood what dragons represented. The sight of Balerion alone could alter political calculations. A lord responsible for protecting a castle, family, and people had to weigh pride against survival. Some concluded that resistance served no purpose. Others believed no conqueror could truly master Westeros. Among those who refused stood Harren the Black. His newly completed fortress of Harrenhal represented one of the greatest construction projects in Westerosi history. Massive towers rose beside the God's Eye. Walls stretched across enormous distances. Countless laborers had died raising them. Harren believed his castle made him invulnerable. Stone walls had protected kings for centuries. Thick gates, immense battlements, and towering keeps seemed capable of resisting any conventional siege. Harren trusted in lessons that had remained true throughout recorded history. The problem was that dragons changed the meaning of every lesson. A castle existed to keep enemies outside its walls. Dragons ignored walls. Armies depended upon roads and supply lines. Dragons flew over both. Kingdoms relied upon distance for security. Dragons collapsed distance. As Aegon's forces secured footholds along the Blackwater and gathered support among discontented river lords, the confrontation with Harrenhal drew nearer. The greatest fortress in Westeros stood waiting beside the waters of the God's Eye, and inside its black towers, a king believed himself safe. Before long, he would discover the difference between strength built by men and power carried on dragon wings. Why did Harren the Black trust stone more than every warning placed before him? The question sits at the heart of one of the most famous moments in Westerosi history. Harrenhal had spent decades building Harrenhal, drawing labor and wealth from every corner of his domains. The fortress dwarfed every castle that existed before it. 5 immense towers rose above the northern shore of the God's Eye. Its curtain walls were so thick that generations later they would still inspire awe. Harren looked upon those walls and saw permanence. Aegon looked upon them and saw a trap. As Aegon's forces advanced into the Riverlands, support for House Hoare began to crumble. The Ironborn kings had ruled the region through conquest and intimidation rather than ancient loyalty. River lords remembered older dynasties that had ruled before the Hoares arrived from the Iron Islands. House Tully of River Run emerged as a focal point for resistance. Lord Edmund Tully declared for Aegon and encouraged other river lords to do the same. One by one, houses abandoned Harren. The king who possessed the greatest castle in Westeros found himself increasingly isolated inside it. The warnings came repeatedly. Aegon offered terms. Advisors urged caution. Even members of Harren's own household reportedly questioned whether any wall could withstand dragon fire. Harren rejected every suggestion. His confidence rested upon centuries of military logic. Castles existed because they worked. Invaders could starve outside walls, siege engines could be destroyed, assaults could fail. No king before Aegon had ever possessed a weapon capable of turning a fortress itself into the enemy. Harren trusted the lessons of the past because they had always been true. Then came the night when history changed. Aegon approached Harrenhal mounted upon Balerion the Black Dread. The enormous dragon circled above the fortress while darkness gathered over the God's Eye. Below, thousands watched from both armies. Harren and his remaining sons remained inside the castle. They believed themselves protected by stone, iron, and height. Instead, those very strengths sealed their fate. The histories describe what followed with remarkable consistency. Balerion descended through the night sky and unleashed dragon fire upon Harrenhal. Stone did not burn, but it softened and cracked beneath temperatures unlike anything produced by ordinary flame. Towers glowed red, gates melted, walls blackened and twisted. The heat surged through chambers, corridors, and vaults. Harren the Black and his sons died inside the fortress they had believed unconquerable. Even centuries later, visitors can still see the scars. The towers of Harrenhal remain warped and melted, their stone flowing in strange shapes, as though it had once become liquid. Every lord who later occupied the castle lived among those scars. The ruined towers served as a permanent reminder that dragons had altered the rules of warfare. A castle could still stop an army. It could no longer guarantee safety from the sky. In one night, Aegon transformed military reality throughout Westeros. Why did the fall of Harrenhal matter far beyond the death of a single king? Because it was not merely a victory. It was a demonstration. Thousands heard the story. Lords repeated it in great halls. Maesters recorded it. Messengers carried news across the continent. The destruction of Harrenhal announced that resistance would require more than strong walls and ancient traditions. Every ruler in Westeros now had evidence of what dragonfire could accomplish. The Riverlands submitted rapidly afterward. Aegon rewarded loyalty rather than ruling through direct occupation. Edmund Tully, whose family had supported the invasion early, was elevated as Lord Paramount of the Trident. The decision established a pattern that would define Targaryen rule. Aegon did not intend to replace every noble house. Instead, he sought obedience from existing powers. Those who bent the knee often retained lands, titles, and privileges. Those who resisted faced a harsher fate. While Aegon secured the Riverlands, events elsewhere moved just as quickly. Visenya and Rhaenys continued separate campaigns that expanded the reach of the invasion. Their dragons appeared over castles and towns whose inhabitants had only heard rumors of dragon lords. In many places, resistance evaporated upon sight of Vhagar or Meraxes descending from the clouds. The sisters were proving a lesson of their own. Conquest depended not only upon destruction, but also upon mobility. 3 dragons allowed the Targaryens to be everywhere at once. Yet the greatest challenge still lay ahead. In the fertile fields of the Reach and the wealthy lands of the Westerlands, 2 powerful kings recognized the danger before them. King Mern IX, Gardener of Highgarden, and King Loren I Lannister of Casterly Rock set aside their differences and formed an alliance. Together they assembled an army unlike any Westeros had previously seen. Contemporary estimates vary, but the combined force likely numbered tens of thousands of men. Knights, archers, men-at-arms, bannermen, and cavalry gathered beneath the banners of the Golden Lion and the Green Hand. From a traditional military perspective, the alliance possessed every advantage. The Reach was populous and rich. The Westerlands controlled immense resources through gold and trade. Their armies outnumbered Aegon's forces significantly. Many commanders throughout history would have welcomed such odds. The coalition kings believed that they could crush the invader through overwhelming strength. Against any ordinary enemy, they would likely have been correct. Why did the largest army in Westeros collapse in a single day? The answer begins with a battlefield, later known throughout history as the Field of Fire. Aegon understood that numbers alone did not determine victory. He chose ground carefully. His forces maneuvered against the advancing coalition. Visenya and Rhaenys joined him with their dragons. For one of the few times in recorded history, Balerion, Vhagar, and Meraxes would fight together above the same battlefield. As the armies approached one another, banners stretched across the horizon. The men of the Reach and Westerlands marched beneath centuries of tradition and confidence. They had kings they trusted, commanders they respected, and numbers that seemed impossible to overcome. Yet overhead, 3 immense shadows moved across the clouds. Before sunset, those shadows would write one of the most devastating chapters in the history of Westeros, and the age of independent kingdoms would begin to die in fire. Why did the Field of Fire succeed, where so many larger armies throughout history had failed? The answer is not simply that dragons were powerful. Dragons had existed before. Armies had existed before. What happened on the Field of Fire was the moment when 3 dragon riders coordinated their strength against the largest host assembled in Westeros during that age. The battle transformed dragons from frightening creatures into instruments of political reality. Afterward, no king could honestly claim ignorance about what resistance might cost. King Mern the Ninth Gardener and King Loren the First. Lannister marched with confidence. The Reach alone could raise immense armies, drawing strength from fertile lands and prosperous towns. The Westerlands added experienced soldiers, wealthy lords, and renowned knights. Together, their banners stretched across the landscape. Men who had spent their lives preparing for war rode toward battle, believing they outnumbered the invader decisively. Against a conventional foe, they almost certainly would have. Aegon's own army stood in their path, but the true weapon waited above. As battle commenced, Balerion, Vhagar, and Meraxes descended from the sky. The exact sequence varies slightly among accounts, yet the outcome remains clear. Dragonfire swept across packed formations of soldiers. Horses panicked, ranks collapsed, fields became infernos. Warriors who had never witnessed dragons at close range suddenly found themselves trapped inside a nightmare beyond anything described in military experience. The name Field of Fire was not poetic exaggeration. Thousands died in the flames. King Mern the Ninth Gardener perished alongside many of his sons, ending a royal dynasty that had ruled the Reach for thousands of years. House Gardener vanished from history in a single afternoon. The extinction of such an ancient line shocked Westeros almost as much as the battle itself. Entire generations had assumed the Gardeners would rule forever. Fire proved otherwise. King Loren Lannister survived where Mern did not. Recognizing that further resistance was hopeless, he submitted to Aegon afterward. The decision preserved House Lannister and allowed it to continue ruling the Westerlands as lords paramount under Targaryen authority. Once again, Aegon demonstrated his preferred approach. Submission brought survival. Defiance invited destruction. The contrast between Loren Lannister and Harren Hoare became one of the defining lessons of the conquest. The fate of the Reach required a new political settlement. Aegon elevated House Tyrell, former stewards of Highgarden, to become lords paramount of the Reach. The choice surprised some contemporaries. Older and more prestigious houses existed within the region. Yet House Tyrell had opened the gates of Highgarden after the death of Mern Gardener and accepted Aegon's authority. Loyalty earned reward. Throughout the coming decades, many ambitious nobles would remember that lesson. Why did some victories come through fire, while others required almost none at all, because conquest demanded more than military force. As Aegon advanced through one region, Visenya and Rhaenys secured others through diplomacy, intimidation, and speed. The sisters often achieved results that armies alone could not. Their campaigns revealed that dragons possessed value even when they never breathed a single flame. Sometimes merely seeing one circling overhead was enough to alter a lord's calculations. The Vale provides one of the most remarkable examples. At the Eyrie, Queen Regent Shera Arryn governed on behalf of her young son, King Ronald Arryn. The Vale's mountain defenses had protected it from countless enemies. Invading armies struggled to cross the bloody gate and the difficult terrain beyond. Traditional military wisdom suggested the kingdom could resist for a long time. Visenya ignored traditional military wisdom. Mounted upon Vagar, she flew directly to the Eyrie. The journey bypassed every castle, gate, and mountain pass designed to stop invaders. According to the histories, Visenya landed in the Eyrie's courtyard, while young Ronald Arryn delighted in the sight of the dragon. Some accounts say the boy even asked to ride Vagar. The image is almost peaceful when compared with the horrors of Harrenhal and the Field of Fire, yet its political consequences proved enormous. Shera Arryn submitted, and the Vale joined Aegon's growing realm without a major battle. The episode reveals much about Visenya herself. Later generations often remembered her primarily as stern, severe, and warlike. Those traits certainly existed. She carried dark sister and possessed a reputation for formidable resolve. Yet the submission of the Vale demonstrates a subtler side. Visenya understood precisely when force should be displayed and when it should remain unused. A dragon perched quietly in a courtyard could sometimes achieve more than a dragon attacking from the sky. Rhaenys achieved similar successes elsewhere. The younger queen often excelled in situations requiring charm, conversation, and personal diplomacy. Chroniclers frequently contrast her with Visenya, though the differences can become exaggerated in retellings. Both women were intelligent and capable. Both rode dragons. Both participated actively in the conquest. The distinction lies more in style than ability. Where Visenya inspired caution, Rhaenys often inspired trust. Why do later songs speak so often of Aegon while treating his sisters as supporting figures? The surviving record itself contradicts that impression. Again and again, Visenya and Rhaenys appear at the center of events. They negotiated submissions, commanded campaigns, and influenced strategy. Without Vagar and Meraxes, the conquest would have unfolded far differently. Without Visenya and Rhaenys, it might not have succeeded at all. Yet one kingdom remained beyond Aegon's reach. In the far north, Torrhen Stark had not yet made his decision. The king in the north gathered his banners and marched south with a formidable host. Stark warriors crossed the neck. Northern lords assembled beneath dire wolf banners. Reports of dragons, burning castles, and fallen kings reached them daily. Ahead lay the trident. Beyond it waited Aegon Targaryen and 3 dragons. Soon, Torrhen Stark would face a choice that would define his reputation for the next 300 years. Why did Torrhen Stark surrender when every northern king before him had defended his crown? For many later generations, the question seemed almost painful. The kings of winter had fought wildlings, ironborn, Andal invaders, and rival northern houses for thousands of years. Pride ran deep in the blood of the North. Yet when Torrhen Stark marched south and confronted Aegon Targaryen, he chose a path none of his ancestors had taken. Some called him weak. History would tell a different story. Torrhen crossed the neck with a substantial army and advanced toward the Trident. His banners included many of the great houses of the North: Karstarks, Umbers, Manderleys, Dustins, Serwyns, and others marched beneath the direwolf standard. Reports of Aegon's victories accompanied every mile of their journey. Harrenhal had fallen. The Field of Fire had shattered the greatest army in Westeros. Kings who once seemed invincible were dead. Even so, the North continued southward. Aegon established his position near the Trident. The exact size of both forces remains uncertain, but the confrontation itself is well documented. Across the river stood the northern host. Across from them stood the Dragon Lords and their supporters. More important than any soldier were the three dragons. Balerion, Vhagar, and Meraxes represented a threat unlike anything the Starks had ever encountered. The North could fight men. It had no answer for dragonfire. The critical moment occurred before battle began. Torrhen Stark's scouts and advisors witnessed the dragons firsthand. They saw their size. They saw the devastation that had already followed them across the continent. During councils held beneath northern banners, commanders debated their options. Some urged battle, others urged caution. Torrhen listened carefully. The decision he eventually reached would preserve his people at the cost of his crown. The next morning, rather than crossing the river to attack, Torrhen rode into Aegon's camp. There he knelt and submitted. The ancient kingdom of the North ceased to exist as an independent realm. Torrhen surrendered his crown and became Lord of Winterfell and Warden of the North under Targaryen authority. The histories remember him as Torrhen Stark, the king who knelt. The title endured long after his death. Why has that title often been spoken with disappointment when the outcome suggests wisdom? Because people admire heroic resistance more easily than prudent restraint. Had Torrhen chosen battle, songs might have celebrated his courage. The reality would likely have resembled the Field of Fire. Thousands of northern soldiers would have died. Winterfell might have burned. Ancient bloodlines could have ended in a single afternoon. Torrhen sacrificed personal glory to preserve the North itself. The pattern repeated elsewhere. Kingdom after kingdom joined Aegon's growing realm. Some entered through negotiation, others entered through defeat. By now, only one region remained truly unconquered. Far to the south lay Dorne, a land unlike any other in Westeros. Deserts stretched beneath scorching skies. Mountains guarded key passes. Noble houses traced lineages shaped as much by Rhoynish heritage as by Andal traditions. Most importantly, the Dornish possessed a political culture that would prove exceptionally difficult to dominate. Why did Dorne resist when stronger kingdoms had already fallen? The answer begins with its rulers. House Martell governed from Sunspear, but Dorne functioned differently from the feudal kingdoms to the north. The title prince or princess remained in use rather than king or queen. Rhoynish influence survived through inheritance customs and cultural traditions. The people of Dorne viewed themselves as distinct. Independence was not merely a political arrangement, it formed part of their identity. At the center of this resistance stood Princess Meria Martell, remembered by history as the Yellow Toad of Dorne. She was elderly by the time Aegon launched his campaigns, blind in one eye and physically frail, she nevertheless possessed immense determination. When Aegon's envoys arrived demanding submission, Maria rejected the offer. According to tradition, she famously declared, "Dorne has no king. Tell your brother that." The words captured the spirit of her realm. Aegon responded with force. His armies advanced into Dorne while dragons ranged overhead. Castles fell, settlements burned, strongholds were occupied. On the surface, the campaign resembled earlier Targaryen successes. Yet the Dornish refused to fight according to expectations. Rather than risking large armies in open battle, they dispersed. Garrisons abandoned castles before dragons arrived. Warriors vanished into deserts and mountains. When invaders moved on, resistance returned behind them. The strategy frustrated every advantage the Targaryens possessed. Dragons excelled against armies and fortifications. They could burn castles, devastate formations, and terrorize populations. They could not easily destroy an enemy that refused to remain in one place. Again and again, Aegon's forces captured territory only to lose control of it afterward. Dornish fighters struck supply lines, isolated garrisons, and small detachments. Victory remained elusive. Visenya and Rhaenys played major roles throughout these operations. The sisters flew repeated missions over hostile territory, attacking strongholds and supporting advancing armies. Yet even dragons struggled against an enemy who transformed the landscape itself into a weapon. The deserts punished invaders. The mountains concealed defenders. Every apparent success dissolved into new challenges. The campaign became a contest of endurance rather than conquest. Why did the most tragic event of the entire conquest occur only after Aegon had already defeated nearly every other kingdom? Because Dorne still possessed the capacity to surprise its enemies. In 10 AC, during operations against Hellhold, seat of House Uller, Rhaenys Targaryen rode Meraxes above the castle's defenses. What happened next would change the history of House Targaryen forever. A lucky shot from a Dornish scorpion struck Meraxes in the eye. The great dragon screamed, lost control, and fell from the sky. The death of Meraxes shocked the realm. One of the three dragons that had conquered kingdoms now lay broken in the sands of Dorne. More mysterious still was the fate of Rhaenys herself. Some accounts claim she died instantly when the dragon crashed. Others suggest she survived the fall and lived for a time afterward in Dornish captivity. The sources disagree and certainty remains impossible. Yet one fact is beyond dispute. The younger queen vanished, and neither Aegon nor Visenya would ever be the same again. What truly happened to Rhaenys Targaryen after Meraxes fell from the sky? More than 3 centuries later, the question remains unanswered. The official histories preserve multiple possibilities, none entirely satisfying. One account suggests that both dragon and rider died immediately upon impact. Another claims Rhaenys survived the fall and lingered in agony within Dornish captivity. The uncertainty itself became part of the tragedy. Aegon conquered kingdoms through decisive action, yet when it came to the fate of the woman he had shared his life with, he could obtain no certainty at all. The death of Meraxes alone represented an enormous loss. Alongside Balerion and Vhagar, Meraxes had formed the triumvirate of dragons that carried the conquest across Westeros. The dragon's skull would later be brought to King's Landing and displayed among the remains of other Targaryen dragons. Even in death, Meraxi's inspired awe. The skull measured vast dimensions, a reminder of the creature that once darkened battlefields beneath its wings. Yet for Aegon and Visenya, the loss was personal before it was political. Contemporary accounts suggest a noticeable change in Aegon afterward. The Dragon Lord, who had previously balanced conquest with calculated restraint, now pursued vengeance with relentless determination. If Rhaenys had indeed died at Hellholt, grief fueled his anger. If she survived somewhere within Dorne, the uncertainty likely made the wound even deeper. The surviving sources cannot reveal his private thoughts. They can reveal his actions. Those actions would become known as the Dragon's Wrath. Why did Aegon unleash such devastation upon Dorne when earlier campaigns elsewhere had often ended with negotiated settlements? Because the circumstances differed profoundly. A king defeated in battle could submit. A castle destroyed might surrender. The disappearance of Rhaenys offered no such resolution. Beginning in 10 AC, Aegon and Visenya launched repeated dragon attacks across Dorne. Castles burned. Strongholds were reduced to ruins. The campaign reached nearly every corner of the principality. Balerion and Vhagar became instruments of punishment. Dragonfire descended upon Sunspear, Hellholt, Sandstone, the Tor, and numerous other locations. Lords abandoned seats rather than face direct attack. Some castles changed hands repeatedly, others stood empty when dragons arrived. Yet even amid destruction, the Dornish strategy remained largely intact. They continued avoiding decisive battles. They endured losses, but refused submission. Again and again, the invaders discovered that victory and control were not the same thing. One particularly striking episode involved the capture of Will. At various points in the conflict, castles fell into Targaryen hands, only to be retaken later. The struggle resembled a tide moving back and forth across harsh terrain. Traditional measures of conquest proved increasingly difficult to apply. A castle could be burned, a lord could be killed. The determination of an entire people proved harder to extinguish. Dorne absorbed punishment that might have broken other kingdoms. Then came one of the most mysterious moments in the entire reign of Aegon I. According to the histories, a letter arrived from Dorne under a banner of peace. The contents of the message have never been revealed. Aegon read it privately. Witnesses reportedly observed a dramatic reaction. Some accounts claim his hand trembled. Others state his expression darkened immediately. Whatever he learned, the letter changed everything. Why did a single letter succeed where years of warfare had failed? No definitive answer exists. Theories multiplied across centuries. Some suggest the letter contained proof that Rhaenys had survived after the fall and suffered terribly before dying. Others believe it included threats directed toward Aenys, Aegon's heir. Still others argue it revealed information known only to Aegon and the Dornish leadership. The truth vanished with those who read it, yet the consequences were unmistakable. Shortly afterward, hostilities eased. The dragon's wrath came to an end. Dorne remained unconquered. Aegon, who had brought 6 kingdoms beneath his authority, accepted an outcome that would have seemed impossible at the beginning of the conquest. The principality remained independent throughout his lifetime. The achievement highlights the limits of even dragon power. Westeros could be united by force. Not every people could be compelled to surrender their identity. While conflict smoldered in the south, another transformation was occurring elsewhere. The temporary camp established near the Blackwater Rush had begun evolving into something far greater. Traders arrived first, craftsmen followed, soldiers required supplies, nobles required residences, merchants recognized opportunity. A settlement emerged around the Aegon fort, growing larger with each passing year. Without formal planning, the foundations of a capital were taking shape. Why did Aegon choose this location rather than an ancient seat like Old Town, Harrenhal, or Storm's End? Geography offered part of the answer. The site occupied a central position relative to the new realm. It stood near major waterways and trade routes. More importantly, it belonged to no defeated dynasty. Winterfell belonged to the Starks. Casterly Rock belonged to the Lannisters. Highgarden belonged to the Tyrells. The new capital would belong to the crown itself. The settlement eventually became King's Landing. At first it was rough, crowded, and chaotic compared with older cities. Roads struggled to keep pace with growth. Wooden structures rose quickly. Docks expanded along the riverbanks. Yet energy flowed through the place. People from every region of Westeros arrived seeking opportunity. Soldiers who had marched in the conquest found homes there. Merchants established businesses. The city reflected the kingdom itself, a collection of different peoples drawn together under a new political order. Above this growing city stood the symbol that would define Targaryen rule. Aegon ordered the creation of a throne unlike any before it. Thousands of surrendered swords from defeated enemies were collected. Blacksmiths worked for years under the supervision of dragonfire. The resulting Iron Throne was intentionally uncomfortable. Jagged edges projected from its surface. Sharp blades remained visible. The message was clear. Rule was not meant to be a place of comfort. As King's Landing expanded around it, the Iron Throne became the physical embodiment of the realm Aegon, Visenya, and Rhaenys had forged through fire, blood, and sacrifice. How does a conqueror transform victory on the battlefield into a kingdom that can survive after the battle's end? The question confronted Aegon once the wars of conquest began giving way to the responsibilities of rule. Burning castles and defeating kings had united much of Westeros beneath a single crown. Governing that territory required something different. Armies could compel obedience for a season. Institutions had to secure it for generations. The true test of Aegon's achievement began after the fighting slowed. One of the most important moments occurred not on a battlefield but in Old Town. Although Aegon had already established himself as ruler through conquest, legitimacy mattered in Westeros. The faith of the Seven held enormous influence across much of the continent. Kings drew authority not only from military strength, but also from religious recognition. Understanding this, Aegon traveled to Old Town. There within the Starry Sept, he was anointed and crowned by the High Septon. The symbolism carried enormous weight. A Valyrian dragon lord, descended from a family that practiced customs many Westerosi considered strange, received blessing from the most important religious authority in the realm. The High Septon placed a crown upon Aegon's head and proclaimed him king. The ceremony did not erase cultural differences between the Targaryens and their subjects. It did, however, create a bridge between them. Faith and conquest now pointed toward the same throne. Old Town itself played a unique role in the transition. Seat of House Hightower and home of the Citadel, It represented learning, religion, and continuity. Unlike Harrenhal or the Field of Fire, Old Town entered the new kingdom peacefully. Lord Hightower submitted without resistance. The city escaped destruction. In return, it retained its importance. Aegon demonstrated once again that he preferred cooperation whenever possible. Fire remained available, but it was not always necessary. Why did so many powerful houses accept a foreign dynasty when they might have continued resisting? Part of the answer lies in how Aegon distributed authority. The Starks remained at Winterfell. The Lannisters remained at Casterly Rock. The Arryns remained in the Vale. The Tullys governed the Riverlands. The Tyrells governed the Reach. Local rulers retained substantial control over their regions. Aegon sought loyalty, taxes, military support, and recognition of royal supremacy. He did not attempt to erase every existing tradition. This flexibility proved remarkably effective. Many conquered peoples experienced less disruption than they expected. Laws continued, castles remained occupied by familiar families, trade resumed, harvests continued. For ordinary small folk, daily life often changed, less dramatically than the songs later suggested. A farmer in the Reach still planted crops. A fisherman in the north still cast nets into cold waters. The banner above the kingdom had changed. Much else remained recognizable. At the center of this system stood King's Landing. The city expanded rapidly during Aegon's reign. Ships crowded its harbor. Markets spread through growing districts. New residents arrived constantly. Unlike ancient seats such as Winterfell or Casterly Rock, King's Landing possessed no deep historical identity yet. Its identity emerged alongside the kingdom itself. As the realm unified, the city grew into a reflection of that unity. Why did Visenya remain such a powerful figure even after the wars ended? Because her influence extended far beyond the battlefield. The Elder Queen never became a passive observer of government. She remained deeply involved in matters of security, administration, and royal authority. Her practical nature often complemented Aegon's broader vision. Where others saw stability, Visenya looked for vulnerabilities. That habit would shape one of her most lasting contributions. The story begins with an attempted assassination. During one public appearance, a would-be attacker came dangerously close to Aegon. Accounts differ regarding precise details, but the incident exposed a weakness in royal security. Dragons could destroy armies. They could not stop a knife hidden in a crowd. Visenya recognized the danger immediately. A king who ruled an entire continent required protection beyond ordinary household guards. The solution became the King's Guard. 7 knights chosen for loyalty and martial skill would dedicate their lives to protecting the king and royal family. The number reflected the faith of the 7, helping connect the institution to Westerosi tradition. Their white cloaks became symbols recognized throughout the realm. Over the centuries, individual members would rise and fall in reputation, yet the order itself endured. Few institutions created during Aegon's reign proved as influential. Visenya's role in establishing the King's Guard reveals an important aspect of her character. Popular retellings often reduce her to a severe warrior queen wielding Dark Sister. The reality preserved in the histories is more substantial. She thought constantly about power and its vulnerabilities. She understood that ruling required preparation for dangers others overlooked. The King's Guard emerged from that understanding. Meanwhile, the royal family itself was changing. Aegon's heir, Prince Aenys Targaryen, grew toward adulthood. Born to Rhaenys, Aenys possessed a temperament very different from his father. He was gentle, courteous, and inclined toward peace. Visenya's son, Prince Maegor Targaryen, presented a stark contrast. Strong, fierce, and formidable in combat, Maegor inherited many qualities associated with his mother. Even during Aegon's lifetime, observers noticed the differences between the two princes. Why would those differences eventually matter so much? Because succession always lurks beneath the surface of monarchy. A kingdom can survive external threats more easily than uncertainty within the ruling family. During Aegon's reign, the issue remained manageable. The king lived, the realm prospered. Yet the future was already taking shape. Aenys represented one vision of Targaryen rule. Maegor represented another. The tension between those paths would not fully emerge until after Aegon's death. For the moment, however, the kingdom remained secure beneath the shadow of Balerion. Roads connected distant regions. Trade increased. Royal authority spread gradually through institutions and customs. From the wall in the north to the deserts of Dorne, rulers and commoners alike adjusted to a reality that would have seemed impossible only a generation earlier. Westeros had become one realm. Yet the greatest dragon lord in its history was growing older, and time remained the one enemy even dragons could not defeat. Why does the reign of Aegon the Conqueror often feel calmer than the generations that followed him? The answer becomes clearer the longer one studies the history. Aegon achieved something extraordinarily difficult. He united powerful rivals beneath a single authority while still possessing the personal prestige to hold them together. Lords who disliked one another could nevertheless respect the man who had defeated kings, ridden Balerion, and forged a new realm. The kingdom's institutions were still young, but Aegon himself served as a living foundation beneath them. The challenge would come when that foundation disappeared. By the later years of his reign, Aegon had become less the conquering dragon lord and more the symbol of a united Westeros. He traveled throughout the realm holding courts, settling disputes, and reinforcing royal authority. Such journeys mattered greatly in a kingdom of immense size. Roads remained difficult. Communication moved slowly. The personal presence of the king carried enormous significance. Lords who saw Aegon upon the Iron Throne in King's Landing experienced one form of royal power. Those who witnessed him arrive atop Balerion experienced another. Balerion himself became increasingly legendary during these years. The Black Dread had been born in Valyria before the Doom, making him a living connection to a vanished civilization. Few creatures in history carried so much symbolism. When people looked upon Balerion, they saw more than a dragon. They saw the memory of the Freehold, the destruction of Harrenhal, the Field of Fire, and the rise of the Iron Throne. As years passed, dragon and rider became almost inseparable in the imagination of the realm. Yet time changes even legends. The children born after the conquest grew into adults who had never known independent kings in the Reach, the Westerlands, or the Riverlands. For them, the Seven Kingdoms already existed as a single political reality. This transformation is easy to overlook because it occurred gradually. A farmer born during Aegon's reign would grow up hearing stories about former kingdoms the same way later generations heard stories about ancient heroes. Memory was already becoming history. Why did Dorne remain such a persistent concern, even after open warfare diminished? Because its independence stood as a visible reminder that Aegon's work remained unfinished. 6 kingdoms acknowledged Targaryen authority. Dorne did not. Diplomacy, raids, negotiations, and tensions continued throughout the remainder of Aegon's life. The southern principality remained beyond his grasp. For a conqueror who had achieved so much elsewhere, the exception mattered. The contrast between Dorne and the rest of Westeros fascinated contemporaries. The North had submitted, the Vale had submitted, the Reach and Westerlands had submitted after defeat. Even powerful Storm's End had fallen. Dorne alone endured. Some observers viewed this as failure, others regarded it as evidence that the limits of power exist even in the Age of Dragons. The question would continue influencing Targaryen rulers long after Aegon was gone. Meanwhile, the issue of succession slowly moved closer. Prince Aenys remained heir to the Iron Throne. His position was never seriously challenged during Aegon's lifetime. Nevertheless, differences between Aenys and his half-brother Maegor became increasingly apparent. Aenys preferred diplomacy and harmony. Maegor excelled in martial pursuits and displayed immense confidence. Supporters gathered around both princes. Most remained loyal to the established line of succession, but the contrast could not be ignored. Visenya watched these developments closely. Her influence at court remained considerable. She had fought beside Aegon during the conquest and helped shape the institutions of the realm. She also understood the dangers that accompanied uncertain transitions of power. Kingdoms often appear strongest immediately before instability emerges. The very success of Aegon's reign concealed tensions that had not yet been tested. Peace can hide fractures just as effectively as war reveals them. Why do so many historians describe Aegon as a pragmatic ruler rather than an ideological one? Because his actions consistently favored results over rigid principles. He worked with the faith despite practicing Valyrian traditions. He preserved noble houses instead of replacing them. He rewarded loyalty regardless of whether it came from ancient dynasties or recently elevated families. Again and again, he chose arrangements that strengthened the realm. The pattern suggests a ruler more interested in stability than in imposing uniformity. That pragmatism appeared clearly in his treatment of conquered regions. The Starks remained guardians of the North. The Arryns retained the Vale. The Lannisters continued ruling the Westerlands. The Tullys and Tyrells governed territory granted through royal favor. Local customs survived. Regional identities endured. The 7 kingdoms became politically united without becoming culturally identical. Aegon recognized that forcing complete uniformity would create endless resistance. As the years advanced, the king who had once crossed Blackwater Bay with dragons and a modest army became an aging monarch overseeing an established realm. The transformation is striking when viewed from a distance. The conqueror gradually disappeared behind the crown. New generations knew him first as king rather than invader. Yet beneath the ceremonies, councils, and laws remained the same individual who had studied the painted table on Dragonstone and imagined a different future for Westeros. Why does the end of Aegon's life feel quieter than the beginning? Because the greatest battles had already been fought. No rival king marched against him. No massive coalition gathered to challenge his authority. The realm he created endured around him. Cities expanded. Trade routes flourished. Lords settled disputes through royal institutions. Even Dorne, unconquered though it remained, no longer faced the same relentless campaigns of earlier years. The kingdom had entered a period of relative stability. Then, in 37 AC, the reign came to an end. Aegon the Targaryen died after ruling for nearly 4 decades. The precise details of his final days receive less attention than his victories, yet the significance is immense. The first Targaryen king was gone, the man who had united most of Westeros, destroyed dynasties, founded a capital, and forged the Iron Throne passed into history. Behind him stood a legacy, unlike any ruler before him. Ahead waited the uncertainty of succession, where the true durability of his creation would soon be tested. Why did Aegon's legacy survive when so many conquerors throughout history were forgotten soon after their deaths? The question becomes more compelling the longer one studies the centuries that followed. Many rulers won battles, many expanded territories. Few created political systems that endured long beyond their own lifetimes. Aegon's kingdom faced rebellions, civil wars, religious conflicts, succession crises, and eventually the extinction of dragons themselves. Yet the realm he forged remained recognizable through all of it. The durability of that achievement may be even more remarkable than the conquest itself. When Aegon died in 37 AC, the crown passed to Aenys the Targaryen. The transition immediately revealed a truth that had been hidden during Aegon's reign. The king himself had been one of the strongest pillars supporting the kingdom. His authority rested not only upon laws and institutions, but also upon personal reputation. Aenys inherited the Iron Throne, yet he could not inherit the exact mixture of fear, respect, and legitimacy his father commanded. Challenges emerged quickly. Rebellions appeared. Opposition hardened. The difficulties of Aenys's reign often encourage historians to ask another question. Did Aegon truly solve the problem of succession, or did he merely postpone it? The answer is complex. He clearly designated Aenys as heir. The succession itself was not disputed upon his death, yet the differences between Aenys and Maegor remained. The tensions visible during Aegon's later years did not disappear. Instead, they expanded into conflicts that would shape the next generation of Targaryen history. Visenya survived Aegon and remained a formidable presence after his death. She continued riding Vhagar, one of the greatest dragons ever known. Her loyalty to House Targaryen never wavered. Yet her vision for preserving the dynasty increasingly centered upon her son, Maegor. Future events would make Maegor one of the most controversial rulers in Westerosi history. Some viewed him as a necessary defender of Targaryen authority. Others remembered him primarily through the name history eventually gave him, Maegor the Cruel. Rhaenys, by contrast, existed only in memory by this point. Yet memory can possess extraordinary power. Songs, stories, and speculation continued surrounding her fate. The mystery of what happened after Meraxes fell never disappeared entirely. Generations revisited the question. Historians examined conflicting accounts. Readers of Fire and Blood and the World of Ice and Fire continue debating the evidence. The uncertainty transformed Rhaenys into something larger than a historical figure. She became one of the great unanswered questions of the age. Why do so many later Targaryens seem obsessed with comparing themselves to Aegon? Because his shadow stretched across nearly 3 centuries of dynastic history. Every king who followed confronted the same impossible comparison. Could they equal the conqueror who forged the Iron Throne? Could they command dragons as he had? Could they unite the realm as effectively? Even rulers, separated from him by many generations, measured success against standards he established. The comparison was often unfair. It was also unavoidable. Jaehaerys I, Viserys I, Daeron I, and many others would be judged partly through the lens of Aegon's accomplishments. Some expanded upon his work, some damaged it. None escaped it. The very title Aegon became significant within the dynasty. Multiple kings would bear the name. The choice was never accidental. Naming a prince Aegon invoked memory, legitimacy, and aspiration all at once. The founder remained present long after his death. Another mystery lingers around Aegon in modern discussions of the lore. Did he conquer Westeros solely for political reasons, or was there a deeper motivation? In recent years, many fans have discussed the theory that Aegon possessed knowledge of a prophetic threat from the north, often associated with later references to the Song of Ice and Fire. It is important to distinguish carefully between sources here. The written histories of the books do not explicitly present Aegon's conquest as being driven by a confirmed prophecy of the others. Certain adaptations and supplementary interpretations explore that possibility more directly. Within book canon, the idea remains an intriguing theory rather than settled fact. Yet the theory persists because it resonates with something already present in Targaryen history. Daenerys the Dreamer saved her family through prophecy. Dragon dreams appear repeatedly throughout the dynasty. Visions and foretellings influence decisions across generations. Whether Aegon acted because of ambition, strategic necessity, personal vision, prophecy, or some combination of all 4 remains unresolved. The uncertainty adds depth rather than confusion. Great historical figures rarely leave behind perfectly clear motives. Why, after everything, does the story of Aegon and his sisters remain fundamentally a story about 3 people rather than 1? Because every major stage of the conquest bears their combined imprint. Aegon carried the central vision. Visenya contributed discipline, military strength, and institutional foresight. Rhaenys brought diplomacy, charisma, and a different kind of courage. Balerion, Vhagar, and Meraxes reflected that partnership in physical form. Remove any one of the 3, and the history of Westeros changes dramatically. As centuries passed, dragons eventually vanished from the world. The Iron Throne endured. Kingdoms rebelled and reconciled. Dynasties rose and fell. Yet the consequences of those early years remained visible everywhere. King's Landing existed because Aegon chose a muddy stretch beside the Blackwater Rush. The great houses held their positions because of decisions made during the conquest. Even conflicts that erupted generations later often traced roots back to structures created during Aegon's reign. History continued building upon foundations laid by the first Targaryen king. And so the story returns to Dragonstone, The sea still crashes against black volcanic cliffs. Salt wind still sweeps across ancient stone. The towers shaped like dragons still watch the narrow sea. Long ago, a young dragon lord stood there beside two sisters and looked west toward a divided continent. The kingdoms beyond the horizon could not know what was coming. Neither could the generations yet unborn who would inherit the world those three riders created. In the fading light above the waves, with dragon fire long extinguished and centuries drifting into memory, the island remains where it always was, keeping silent watch over the beginning of everything. What lingers after the battles fade is not the fire, it is the choice. That is one of the quiet truths hidden inside the story of Aegon and his sisters. When people remember the conquest, they often remember Balerion melting the towers of Harrenhal, the flames of the Field of Fire, or the immense shadows of dragons crossing the sky. Yet the kingdom that endured for centuries was not built from those moments alone. It was built from decisions. Torrhen Stark choosing his people over his pride, Loren Lannister choosing survival over defiance, Visenya choosing vigilance when she created the King's Guard. Again and again, Martin's World reminds you that history changes not only because of great power, but because of what human beings decide to do with that power. There is also a deeper irony woven through the entire tale. Aegon conquered 6 kingdoms and forged the Iron Throne, yet one of the most important lessons of his life came from the place he could never fully conquer. Dorne resisted armies, dragons, fear, and devastation. The lesson is not that power is meaningless. Power matters greatly in this world. Dragons changed the fate of continents. Kings rose and fell because of them. Yet even the greatest force ever seen in Westeros could not erase a people's determination to remain themselves. Throughout A Song of Ice and Fire, that pattern appears again and again. Strength can command obedience. It cannot always command loyalty, memory, or identity. The relationship between Aegon, Visenya, and Rhaenys reveals another truth that echoes through the centuries. The songs often reduce history to a single hero because heroes are easier to remember. Real history rarely works that way. Aegon carried the crown, but Visenya guarded it. Rhaenys softened it. One brought discipline, one brought warmth, one brought vision. Together they accomplished what none of them could have achieved alone. When you look closely at Martin's World, many of its greatest achievements and greatest tragedies emerge from partnerships, families, friendships, and rivalries rather than from solitary figures standing above everyone else. And perhaps that is why the story feels larger than conquest. Beneath the dragons and crowns lies a meditation on legacy. Aegon spent decades creating a realm that would outlive him. Yet the moment he died, the realm began changing in ways he could not control. His heirs would reshape his work. Some would strengthen it, some would damage it. Future generations would argue over his intentions, misunderstand his motives, and invoke his name in causes he never imagined. That is the fate of every legacy. The creator eventually leaves the stage, and the creation belongs to history. You see the same rhythm everywhere in the world of Westeros. Seasons turn, dynasties rise and fall, castles that seem eternal become ruins. Dragons hatch, soar, and vanish. The wall stands for thousands of years, yet even it cannot escape the passage of time. People struggle endlessly to leave their mark upon the world. but the world keeps moving after they are gone. Martin's histories often feel melancholy for this reason. They understand that greatness is real, but they also understand that greatness is temporary. What survives longest is not victory itself. It is the story people continue telling about it. And so, as the night grows quieter around you, the tale returns to where it began. Dragonstone still rises from the sea, black against the dark horizon. The wind still moves across ancient stone. The waves still strike the cliffs below, with the same steady rhythm they knew before the doom of Valyria and before the birth of Aegon Targaryen. Somewhere above those cliffs, in the silence of memory, 3 dragons rest beneath the fading light, while a young dragon lord and his 2 sisters stand together looking west, across the water toward a continent that has not yet changed.